William Smith. This is Joseph Smith's brother. He
Yeah.
lived through this, right? And he said, he was asked the question.
And
he said,
and
well,
he was disaffected from the church.
Yeah.
He left.
Mhm.
So he has no motives to. He could just say a lot of junk if he wanted to about.
Right. Right. I mean, it is his family, so people are like, well, he still would have wanted to defend his family, but Joseph Smith wasn't necessarily the most popular guy in the nation, too. So,
Right.
just. But the question was asked, it said that Joseph and the rest of his family were lazy and indolent. This is what William Smith says. He said, we never heard of such a thing until after Joseph told his vision, and not then by our friends.
Okay, brothers and sisters, welcome back to another program with Hannah Stoddard from the Joseph Smith Foundation. I am here also with Jared from Christian Homestead.
Either way.
I am Troy from the Last Dispensation, and this is kind of both our program at this time. And we have back, actually by popular demand. That's not a trite phrase. People wanted you back, and they want.
I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to talk to you again.
That's good. And I asked you, do you remember the subject matter? It was.
I do. You wanted to go into a specific chapter in the Faith Crisis too, and it kind of goes into Ender's study with Mormonism Unveiled and Richard Bushman, and I was like, okay, this will unlock another door.
I also
conversation.
To help you out, if it's okay, do you mind if we share your website real quick?
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't know if it's updated or how often you do that.
We have a team that's working on a big revision right now, but right now, yeah, go for it.
Okay, let me bring this up here.
While he's pulling that up, how many people are involved in Joseph Smith Foundation? I don't think I asked that last time.
Oh yeah. So it changes because we do it it's project based, and yeah. So like Troy, that's our bookstore, and then we have the main website, which is mostly like free resources and things. But to answer your question, Jared, so everything we do at the Joseph Smith Foundation is volunteer based. So people aren't paid salaries. They're not. It's a labor of love for everyone involved, and so it changes per project. So for example, when we just finished the Helen Mar Kimball book, her biography last year, we probably had about 50 people working on that project, from when it came to like the research to the editing and the footnotes and just doing research and different things like that. And then we have like a certain number of people, I don't have the number right off the top of my head, working on Joseph Smith's teachings right now, and just at different volunteers. So it goes up and down. Based on the project that we're doing and who's involved. And we also work with sometimes other organizations or groups to just work on different projects. So
really
this
cool.
This is wonderful. You've got CDs, right?
Yeah, so we have documentaries.
I mean DVDs, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. And then books, and then some posters and t-shirts.
All kinds of stuff here. This is great. And so you don't it's all volunteer, huh?
Yes.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. So so we'll pay people when we have to, like shipping or, publishing the books, or maybe graphic design or things like that. But as far as like the bulk of the work is, people do it because they're passionate about the restoration. They have a testimony. The gospel has changed their life, and they are like, I want to help. I just want to help other people find that joy. So it's actually really fun. I feel like I work with some of the best people in the world. I think that's the funnest part of my job. It's just the people that I get to work with.
That's so cool. We are definitely going to leave the link again, like we did before, and any other links that you want left. And so the chapter, you mentioned the chapter. So I finished the book.
Awesome. What did you think?
Look at all these little tabs and things like that.
Right.
I can't disagree with it. I mean, you did your homework. So did you and your brother write this?
So that was actually my father.
Oh, that's your father, not your brother. James
and you are not the only one. Yeah, in different like podcasts or videos and stuff, he looked so young in life that everyone either thought that we were married or he was my brother. I was like, no, actually, he's my dad, and he has 10 kids. So
Oh my goodness. Okay. Wow.
and
That's
of course
neat.
he passed away in 2021.
Right.
So yeah.
Right. Okay. I'm just getting old because people, I don't know, he was my age, I think, right?
Yeah, probably he was about 50 when he passed. Yeah. Almost.
Okay. So what I asked you if we could talk about was mainly on the Smith farm.
Mm-hmm.
You did a really cool video on that too.
Yes.
On your YouTube channel, you have
Yes.
one.
That's
Is
going to
that
have
also
the
on
bulk
your
of the
website?
details. Yeah, so it's I think we have a free, if I'm not, if I think it's still available. We have a free download of some chapters, and then yes, a podcast. It's called Rough Stone Rolling, Debunking Rough Stone Rolling, and it is on our YouTube channel for free, and it'll have this conversation plus a lot more. But
so the main chapter that I honed in on was chapter 16,
Mhm.
because it kind of relates, would you say?
Yeah,
To
that
the
is that
Smith
is
farm.
the that's the
Fact checking Bushman's innuendo with
Right.
real data,
Mhm.
which I found fascinating. And my wife and I went over it again last night. She goes, babe, you need to refresh your interviews tomorrow. Wake up. And I kept falling asleep, but it was good stuff. I didn't fall asleep because it was boring.
No,
I
yeah.
was just tired. So I want you to get into the Smith farm.
Yes.
But I wanted to ask you, well, let me see here. You know what? I'll get into this as we go. Why is the Smith farm important
Yes.
in building or proving
In this
the
whole conversation.
the character of the Smith family,
Right.
Joseph Smith as a young man, the affidavits that
Yeah.
were against him through Hurlbut.
Right.
Anyway, go ahead.
Yes. Yes.
Start wherever you
Okay.
want.
No, yeah. No, you're that's a great question. So to lay a little bit of foundation work, and this is in the chapter right before chapter 16. We talk about how if you listened, if whoever's listening to this, if you listen to my other interview here on Last Dispensation Christian Homestead about Leonard Arrington and everything, there was a project that Leonard Arrington and his team were working on called the Sesquicentennial History book project, and it was supposed to come out in 1980. And basically it was a series of volumes about church history, and they had different historians working on it. And what happened was the church did agree to publish it, but then there was a breakdown, and the church actually ended up essentially canceling the project. And that's a whole nother story. There was like all this legal, and Gordon B. Hinckley was actually the point man in those discussions going back and forth. The church was like, we want to get out of this. How can we do this? We have signed contracts and everything. But the reason the conflict and contention came in was primarily over the first volume. And the first volume was written by Richard Bushman, who we now recognize today as the author of Rough Stone Rolling. In that day, at that time, he hadn't written Rough Stone Rolling yet, but he wrote a manuscript that he would later publish as Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism. And that really started a firestorm of controversy among different members of the Quorum of the 12 and different journal authorities. It was this new interpretation of Joseph Smith. And when I say new, it doesn't mean that, I don't mean that the narrative was something that had never been told before or believed, but more that this was the first time it was being brought into the mainstream of the church, or attempted to be brought into the mainstream of the church, because it presented Joseph Smith and the magical worldview, what we recognize today, these different comments that, oh, Joseph Smith was involved in treasure digging or magic, or Joseph Smith Sr. was involved in those kinds of activities. And historically, the church was very staunch on, no, it's not true. Joseph F. Smith came out and just full on, he was like, they're lies. Joseph Smith was no money digger. Gordon B. Hinckley made a comment in General Conference where he said, just because other people in the area were involved in folk magic is no evidence whatsoever that Joseph Smith was involved in that. That was right in General Conference. Plus you had just other statements in the past. And so Richard Bushman acknowledges this. He says all the historians and leadership, just said those stories are coming from anti-Mormons, and we give them no credit any more than we would give credit to Judas Iscariot saying this or that about Jesus Christ, or Caiaphas or Pilate or Herod or any of those characters in the New Testament. They're not creditable. We don't listen. It's not true. But Richard Bushman took the approach where he said, no, I've got to take these sources as legit. Now, what sources is he talking about? That's where we come into this whole conversation of fact checking them today, because there are sources, historical sources, that people alleging that they saw Joseph Smith involved in different kinds of activities like magic and treasure digging and things like that. So the bulk of the story, a primary source for this narrative is Mormonism Unveiled. Now, I've gotten people where they're like, that's not the only one. Yes, I know Mormonism Unveiled is not the only source that talks about Joseph Smith and treasure digging and magic, obviously. I mean, if you go read Joseph Smith's own history, he said rumor with her 1,000 tongues was constantly making up stories about his family. He said that if he was to relate just 100th part of them, he was like it would fill volumes. So in other words, we have no idea today the extent of the crazy stories that were going on about Joseph Smith. But
well, can I ask you real quick?
Yeah.
How do you feel about Bushman's statement where he says the first thing Bushman decided was that I could not dismiss all of Hurlbut's affidavits with a wave of a hand. Academic historians had taken them seriously. No, not that part. I'm sorry. You just answer that. Oh, the part where he says that a lot of people were grave digging. I'm sorry.
Oh, grave digging. Wow.
Yeah, you didn't know that?
Some early attempts at resurrection.
We're digging for treasure. It was kind of like if you took your Geiger counter out or your metal detector on the beach, it was just kind of a pastime, because there was lots of treasure, or there were alleged there was rumor that there was lots of treasure there. I don't know.
And there definitely were people in New York or Pennsylvania or in the early colonies that were involved in those activities. I mean, if you just look at Lucy Mack Smith's own history, she talks about some of those characters. In fact, some of those characters were actually involved in the mobs that were trying to attack Joseph Smith. So the famous story where Joseph Smith goes and gets the plates and he's attacked on his way from the Hill Cumorah. And I don't know if you guys know those stories, or but it's in Lucy Mack Smith's history where he's trying to hide it, and he's hiding it in the cooper shop and different things like that. The man actually leading that banditti was Willard Chase, and he was involved in those kinds of activities, and his sister was basically like the village witch, Sally Chase. And so this is real. Like, no one's saying like, oh, this is all made up. So the question is, but does that mean that the Smiths were involved? So the first thing is, one, like Gordon B. Hinckley said, you can't necessarily link the two. But first, there is no evidence, and I take heat for this, and I will stand by it, and I'm willing to have the conversation with people. But I don't believe there's any credible source that Joseph Smith was involved in magic or in this treasure digging. It doesn't even show up in all of the family. Like, if you go look at the Smith family and the cousins, like I'm descended from Joseph Smith's grandfather through his cousins and his uncle. There's nothing in the language, in their history, in their journals, in their letters that even hints towards that worldview. In fact, in the early days of the church, people were excommunicated for dabbling in that kind of activity by
you can learn
like
a lot of
Smith, Joseph Smith's cousin.
Even on Fair Latter-day Saint, they have an article or a big section about how it wasn't, there would be evidences of that being part of the religion if that was, a thing back then.
Sure.
And people were chastised and rebuked and sanctioned for practicing those things and talking about them. It was not part of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Right. Right. And that's a whole nother conversation we can have, because people say, well, does it really matter? And is there really a difference between magic and the priesthood? And could magic have prepared Joseph Smith? That's a whole conversation that you can have. That's fascinating to have, I think, and needed. But just to finish answering your question, I don't believe there's good, reliable sources for it. Number two, it doesn't show up in any of the family. And number three, it's kind of like saying, okay, you have Nephi coming over to the New World, right, on a ship. Guess what? There's Laman and Lemuel there, and then there's Nephi and Sam and Lehi and Sariah, right? And so, yeah, so was there pretty corrupt behavior going on in the New World with Laman and Lemuel as they apostatized and degenerated in their seat? Absolutely. Does that mean Nephi was involved? No. So just because there were other people in the area. And the other thing to keep in mind is people are like, well, in the early days, Richard Bushman says this, it was no more scandalous than gambling, you know, like playing poker today. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, who is Joseph Smith descended from? Puritans, Pilgrims. And no one studies the Reformation today. No one really studies the Puritan heritage. But if you actually study the righteous founders of America, not the riffraff, but the righteous ones, the ones that came aboard the Mayflower, their worldview, how they thought, they were strict biblical Christians, very strict. I mean, hello, people, the Salem witch trials, right? Which were not conducted based on correct biblical principles of witnesses and trial. And that's actually how they stopped, was one of the Puritans stepped in and said, we're not even following the Bible's rules for judging whether someone's guilty or not and things like that. But again, they were putting people to death if they believed they were involved in these kinds of activities. There were even questions about Christmas. It was illegal in some of the communities because they were like, I don't know, the origins are a little shady. So that's the background that Joseph Smith is coming from. And not only that, again, this is the whole conversation where could Joseph Smith been involved in magic, or could he have kind of dabbled in it? There are two forces in this universe. There's the power of God and there's the power of the adversary. There's the priesthood and then there's the devil's power. And Joseph Smith, from a very, very young age, knew the difference between the two. Remember, at 14, he's walking into the sacred grove. And who does he come face to face with? Well, if you believed in Joseph Smith's own account, he goes face to face with Lucifer. He knows who Lucifer is. He knows what his power feels like. He knows what it is. He sees God the Father and Jesus Christ. When the greatest vision that we really have recorded. This is the only time that we have documented the Father physically appearing. So not a vision or his voice being heard, but he's actually physically present. That's coming to Joseph Smith at 14. So Joseph Smith is having this incredible experience. He says he can't even share what he learned in the first vision. That's him at 14. So he knows the difference between these two forces. He knows more about the gospel than all three of us do put together at that young of an age. Plus, there's just not sources and history to back it up. So anyway, there's so many other reasons.
Okay, so I look at, here's a good thing too. This probably crossed your mind before, and maybe you too, Jared. Look at Joseph Fielding Smith.
Right.
He was our 15th prophet, I believe. Was he
not 15th, because President Nelson is the 17th.
I'm sorry, not 15th, 10th. He was the 10th president of the church. His dad was the 5th president of the church, I believe, which is irrelevant. But so his dad was the direct actual nephew of the prophet. Joseph F. Smith was the nephew of the prophet. He was the son of Hiram.
Mm-hmm.
Joseph Fielding Smith was the grandson of Hiram.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Joseph Fielding Smith talks about his dad talking to him about all of the things handed down. I call them righteous heirlooms, right? Or verbal heirlooms, or what do you call them when you hand down something to your family?
Legacy
legacies, right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't that have rubbed off on him? I mean, he's only 2-3 generations away from Joseph Smith.
Mm-hmm. Well,
you know what
Joseph F. Smith was the one that, go ahead. Sorry. I'm sorry.
And and all of the stories were exactly what we learned in history all the way up until the 70s. Everything that came out of the mouth of Joseph Fielding Smith correlated with historians that were prior to the 70s. Am I right or wrong?
Yes, in general. I mean, there's a few discrepancies, maybe like a little, but in yes, the bulk of the traditional narrative is what was the main narrative. Now,
Right.
you bring up Joseph Fielding Smith, so I have to answer where a few people are going to be like, but. So, like Fiona Givens, for example, she says, well, Joseph F. Smith was traumatized seeing his father Hiram brought home from Carthage. That traumatized him. He carried that. He passed that to his son. So when Joseph Fielding Smith is writing history, he's not writing it as an objective historian. He's writing it with the viewpoint of, I've got to protect my family's name. I have to whitewash my family, and I've got to scrub this clean because we've been persecuted and the Smith family's been hated, and I'm going to change. I'm going to defend. That's that perspective. So when they look at Joseph Fielding Smith, they're like, no. Okay, well, here's the facts. Let's look into Joseph Fielding Smith's history. That history is credible. Now, sure, are there things that we've learned since, like little details, maybe about the Mountain Meadows Massacre? Sure. The more documents we discover going through the Joseph Smith papers, sure. But the substance of the story, the character of Joseph Smith,
the complexities, right?
The bulk, the foundation, the dominant narrative, this idea that Joseph Smith was the greatest prophet to live since Jesus Christ, like that was what was passed down in presidents of the church testified. The idea that, Moroni came, he gives the records that Joseph Smith was truthful, accurate, all of this. The priesthood was restored. Brigham Young faithfully carried on Joseph Smith's legacy and successive presidents of the church, right? This dominant narrative is, I believe, substantiated by the facts and by the history. And Joseph Fielding Smith was not whitewashing history. In fact, there's a statement when he was a very young historian where he talks about, he's like, we have to be truthful. We have to be honest. We cannot hide things that may be inconvenient. That's Joseph Fielding Smith. So he takes a lot of heat, and people say, well, our church history, Joseph Smith just couldn't have really been that good. Well, what if he was? And I'm the first person to say, if he wasn't, then yes, we need to come clean. We need to be honest. Truth and facts are the only way to have a productive conversation and really come to truth and answers. But what if that traditional narrative was true? What if Joseph Smith truly was that great man of character? What if the stories we were told are accurate? There's implications to that.
Yeah. When I was in high school, look, I had finished with my assignments during this one class. I had free time to be on the internet. And that's when I came across my first anti-Mormon stuff. And it really shook me. It shook me. You dig into it. They start questioning different things about the Book of Mormon, according to their supposed research into archaeology and other things like that. And then, of course, the money digging comes up and whatever. And it's like, I feel like there's only two groups that these kind of things really shake. People that are maybe still tender in the gospel or new, that really haven't developed their testimony yet. Because with this whole thing with money digging or seeking for treasure, I think that the idea, the driving force, the adversary is trying to put doubt into your mind and be like, look, Joseph Smith, he was all into this kind of weird stuff. So now you can see how, he just took it further and invented the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon's all about, finding gold plates. And in the Book of Mormon, it talks about slippery treasures. And that's all that Joseph Smith was thinking about. But when you think about it, okay, so let's say that Joseph Smith, some of these things were true. It wouldn't bother me because it's all about how you acquire information and what you hold is valid. First, it should be based on the spirit and based on you praying and studying things. But secondly, and why I think that there's great value in Joseph Smith Foundation and other, YouTubers and other people that do research is doing the research and getting to the absolute source of truth. And unfortunately, some people don't want to take it as far as it needs to go to arrive to the truth because it's hard. It's hard. And Joseph Smith Foundation can facilitate that by showing where you find this and why this is true or not true. But like, if you're it's good to have a testimony, but you have to also do your due diligence and do your own research and tie down your beliefs to solid things. And it requires effort. So anyway, so I think that people that are tender in the gospel, I think that's probably one group, or you have probably people that are more tares in the church that, again, don't really have a testimony. They're kind of fakers anyway, and they might just be kind of like on the fence anyway. And so it's like, these people are like, oh, well, let's just introduce a little bit of doubt. And anyway, that's my commentary about that. But it's just like, you think about like different prophets like Alma the Younger, or you think about Paul, they did bad things before they became prophets. So if it was true that Joseph Smith was involved in whatever, it still wouldn't bother me, because people change, people receive new revelation, they progress. And so it wouldn't be any different with Joseph Smith.
Yes. And if I can just make a comment on that. So I agree, because like you brought up the example of Alma the Younger. The only difference between Richard Bushman's version of Joseph Smith versus, say, the story of Alma the Younger. Sorry, one second.
Whoa, we got bars for a minute.
Yeah, 1 second.
I'm glad it didn't go boop.
How's the weather there in Utah? Snowy, right?
I don't think she can hear you.
Oh yeah, her mic's off. Well, what about in California? Snowy there?
Raining, and there's been all kinds of snow. The Grapevine was shut down, all kinds of places. It's been crazy. It's been crazy.
Okay, I'm sorry about that, guys.
That's okay.
Don't worry about it.
Hopefully that won't make it harder for you to edit.
I'm gonna cut that part out. Don't worry.
Yeah.
And he'll probably leave it up. He just goes.
No, I'll cut it out. Cut it out.
No, yeah. Let me just answer your question there. So the difference, I think this will be pretty clean, so you can just edit. The difference between Richard Bushman and the story of Alma the Younger, and Richard Bushman's version of Joseph Smith, is Alma the Younger went through a change of heart. He had to be converted, right? I mean, read Alma 36. He sees what he's done, how it's offended God, and he goes through intense suffering, and then he has to be born of God and accept the mercy of Jesus Christ and have this experience, right? And he later tells his son, he says, I know what I know about the gospel because I have fasted and I have prayed and I have sacrificed, right? He had to work back. Now take someone like Joseph Smith. There's no evidence of a change of heart in that area. There's nothing. There's no historical record to say, okay, here was Joseph Smith when he was younger, and then he went through this mighty change of heart. I mean, here's Joseph Smith and Joseph Smith history, and he says the worst thing that he ever did his whole life up to that point, he's writing in the early 1830s, he says, was he was a little too jovial with his friends as a teenager. He says that's the worst. I mean, if any of us could say the same, I would be very, so right. So that's Joseph Smith. That's and Richard Bushman takes it a step further. He's not saying that Joseph Smith had a bad past and then he repented. He says that actually magic prepared him for the priesthood, that it was a quote preparatory gospel. Okay, what's the preparatory gospel? It's the Aaronic priesthood. So like, what do we do with our deacons? Do we go like, you know what? We need to prepare them for the priesthood. So let's go take them to a seance, or maybe get them all tarot cards. And, this is going to help them. Richard Bushman says that, learning about spells and having to follow these rituals with exactness could have prepared him to follow Moroni. No, the reason why he listened to Moroni and obeyed the Lord with exactness was because of his faith. It wasn't because of the occult.
And the first vision, right?
Yes.
And that's almost kind of building a straw man when you think about it. I think I'm using the term right. Yeah. He takes that little bit of the magic stuff, and then he goes, therefore, because of that, this prepared him for this. No, I mean, that's very speculative. I mean, there's no evidence
to the scriptures. It's contrary to the gospel.
Well, I wanted to ask you something. So, who was Hiram's wife again? Mary?
Yeah, so there was Jerusha was his first wife, and then she passed away, so he married Mary Fielding.
Okay, so Mary Fielding was Joseph F. Smith was her son, right?
That's right.
Okay, we all know our families, right? You ever sat with your grandma or somebody and said, "So what did grandpa do?" Or they tell you about the stories of when they were little, or
Yep.
you don't think that Joseph Fielding Smith and Joseph F. Smith, it went right from Mary Fielding Smith, right? Because Joseph F. Smith was too young. Well, he was a boy when Hiram and Joseph
Yeah,
were
and his mom
martyred.
passed away before Joseph Fielding was born, but Mary Fielding didn't live very long after. But
Okay.
yeah. But
But
still, it's still the family culture is there. People all knew the Smiths. I mean, we're
Right.
in Utah. Who are your neighbors, right? Who do you hang out with?
Yeah. So also John D. Lee that wrote Mormonism Unveiled, wasn't he kind of involved in
Okay.
spiritualism
So
himself?
that is a different Mormonism Unveiled.
Oh,
So,
okay. See, I'm getting it all
yes.
wrong.
So that is a later publication, later 1800s. He was like an adopted son to Brigham Young, participated in the Mountain Meadows Massacre and things like that. So the
Who wrote
Mormonism,
the original one?
yeah. So the original one is a separate publication. It was published by E.D. Howe. So
Okay, E.D. Howe, that's right.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
But Hurlbut gave her the affidavits.
Yes. So
Now, was she involved in spiritualism or was it Lee?
It was E.D. Howe.
E.D. Howe. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So
and
she's basically calling the kettle black, even though the kettle isn't black, that she's calling black. But
right.
What is that called? Projecting?
So he had a relative that was, and I'm trying to remember if it was a sister or wife, but was actually a member of the church and actually donated money to Joseph Smith. But he was anti-Mormon, and I believe he was Christian at the time of publishing Mormonism Unveiled. But later on in his life, he adopted spiritualism, which is essentially another version of, I would say, the occult. It's a counterfeit version of, I mean, that's what Brigham Young and other early leaders said in several general conferences. But yeah, so you have E.D. Howe publishes Mormonism Unveiled, and this is when the Saints are in Kirtland. But he got most of the material from a man named Dr. Flastus Hurlbut, who was not a doctor, but that was just his first name. So Flastus Hurlbut had been excommunicated from 2 Christian denominations before he joined the Latter-day Saint Church. And then he was very soon after excommunicated on grounds of immorality. And he does the big sob story, pretends to be really penitent. He goes into the council and he's like, "I'm so sorry, this will never happen again." And they say, "Okay, we'll forgive you, we'll allow you back in." And he leaves that council and says, and then is caught bragging later, "I deceived that." He said he deceived Joseph's God, or the spirit by which he was actuated. So he was like, they totally bought my whole story and it wasn't even real. But what he didn't know is that Joseph Smith actually didn't buy his story. So when he left the council had decided, let's give him a second chance. And Joseph Smith just got up and he said, "That man is not sincere. Like, he's not being honest about what's in his heart."
Wow.
So he ends up getting hauled in again. Hurlbut excommunicated for good this time. And then he was just livid, angry. So he swore that he would wash his hands in Joseph Smith's blood, quote, end quote. And so he actually gets funded by a group that is antagonistic to Joseph Smith to go back east and dig up all of the dirt that he can possibly find on the Smith family and the origins of the church and everything. So he goes around, and there is a lot of different discussion, debate. Like when we say affidavits, us today in the 21st century, we think, okay, it's notarized, it's by the court. We have a pretty documented legal system. These are not affidavits in that sense.
Some of it could have been hearsay.
Well, we don't even have the original documents, like people's handwriting. We don't even know if they wrote their own, or if Hurlbut sat there writing while they talked to him, or if some have wondered if he actually went home at the end of the day, like talked to people, then he went home and wrote down, "This person told me this and this and this." So then it's all like, oh, they said this, but who anyway. And so the research itself is a little sketchy, not to mention who he's interviewing. People like Willard Chase, That's one of the affidavits in Mormonism Unveiled. Willard Chase, the guy that was literally attacking Joseph Smith, trying to steal the plates, and his sister's the village witch, right? So that's what we've got going on with Mormonism Unveiled. And then you've got
just really quick, with those affidavits, is there anything that makes them at all legitimate? You say that it's different from how we do it today. Today we have a notary, Like, was there anything to ensure? Because like that's like the purpose of an affidavit is to like officially put down, whatever. So was there some kind of way of validating affidavits back then?
There was, but not in anything with Mormonism Unveiled. All we have is literally what E.D. Howe prints. I believe it was 1834 is what I want to say. I might be wrong on the date, but pretty sure. So, and then there's other stuff about like the origin of the Book of Mormon that since has been like completely disproven, that said it came from someone else other than Joseph Smith. Anyway, so he publishes these so he gathers this information. He comes back to Ohio. Before he can get it published, he's actually pulled up in court and convicted for threatening Joseph Smith's life. And this was in a court that wasn't necessarily favorable to the Mormons, but the evidence was against him. And Joseph Smith actually had to go in and sue him for trying to threaten his life. So anyway, so Hurlbut's convicted. And then it came out that his wife had an affair with one of the Baptists that he was working with. So
wow,
he wasn't exactly considered very reputable by people outside the church, let alone definitely not inside. So he hands all of his research off to E.D. Howe, who himself had a chip on his shoulder against Joseph Smith in the church. The material is published, and the result is that the people are just incensed. The First Presidency actually published a statement at the time, and they said the populace was just livid, which is, again, one of the things that I raised when Richard Bushman says, oh, this stuff wasn't a problem. People were just fine. Everybody was doing it. Really? Then why was everyone ticked? And why did these tales incite people to anger against Joseph Smith? Nobody back then, or very few, were reading Mormonism Unveiled and thinking like, oh, those Smiths are a little weird, but you know what? They're just like everybody else. No, these were slanders. They were attacks. This was designed to not just discredit Joseph Smith in the Restoration, but was actually designed to stir people up, because they're being driven from Kirtland, then they're going to be driven from Missouri, driven from Nauvoo. Like this is an age of violence, really, So, and then just to tie back into what you were saying, Joy, yeah. So E.D. Howe later on did embrace spiritualism and just some really weird views, basically renounced Christian faith, true Christian faith.
Okay, so if I understand this right, because unlike Troy, I haven't read the book, you guys, for everyone watching. So I just want to get it straight in my head. So Richard Bushman was involved in that project, especially the first volume, you said, of what was the book series called again?
Yeah, it was the Sesquicentennial History. That was the name of the project. And then later, since the church wouldn't publish his manuscript, he published it on his own. It's called Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism. Okay.
And he was basing his research partly on what we're talking about right now. Right. These stories that you're talking about that are not really reputable, can't be verified, or you have people that are in question. And so originally in that first volume, or in the series, whatever, he was like, oh yeah, it's fine. Like he was like going along with the idea that Joseph Smith was involved in folk magic and stuff like that, which the church was not supporting. It's like, no, he was not. But that's precisely what anti-Mormons would want to be in a church published thing, is like, see, you guys admit that he was part of
well, that was the anti-Mormon rhetoric for over 100 years at that point.
Yeah, so if that had been published by the church, then that would have just like made things even more difficult. And then later he publishes he publishes it, and then he goes on later to write Rough Stone Rolling. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, because Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism only covers the first few years of Joseph Smith's life and work, and Rough Stone Rolling does the entire span.
Go ahead, Jared. I'm sorry.
No, nothing.
I want to get into the Smith farm.
Right. Because that's what we're getting into, right? It's
But
like,
this
okay,
is
here's where the
all
affidavits
related,
came
and
from, but
that's a good question, Jared, because the Smith family, according to Mormonism Unveiled, there were claims of laziness, alcoholism, ritual magic, treasure digging, and occult animal sacrifice even.
Yeah.
And you put a litany of other charges.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk about why the Smith farm is important, and I want you to just go with
yes.
whatever. But
Because
let me ask you something real quick.
Yeah.
Just real quick. I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Daniel C. Peterson, I like him.
Yeah.
What is he saying now? Because I know before he was kind of against a lot of how does he feel about Richard Bushman and his book Rough Stone Rolling? Because
I mean, I can't represent Daniel C. Peterson, and I agree. Like I like a lot of the work he does. I think we probably disagree on a few things, but I think we're on the same team, right? We're defending the same
right. And I don't mean that like, I just want to know, are there scholars? Is there a lot, or just a handful of scholars that go, no, this is not faith promoting, this is not cool?
Right. So, well, and the thing is too, how many scholars that are willing to come out and say it versus the ones that are, because I have literally sat at lunch tables with scholars that know their stuff very well. And they tell me, good job. I love what you're doing. I could never say it, but like, go for it. Like you guys
and then
go.
others that would call you fringy, kind of, you know what I mean?
Well, so then, but then
you're not the mainstream narrative.
Which is very ironic because we're the ones supporting the mainstream narrative. This is the narrative that was literally held to and defended by the church for over 200 years.
For 160 years, well,
right.
Until the 70s, which doesn't make sense to me because
even later, right? Because
you would go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the like Richard Bushman's manuscript is being debated. It's the basis of the divided opinion among the 12 here in the late 70s. And who's there? Ezra Taft Benson. I think it was Thomas S. Monson. Let's see, I have it marked in here. I'm trying to remember the Mark E. Peterson, Boyd T. Packer, Thomas S. Monson, and Ezra Taft Benson. Those were the ones that were very concerned, at least according to Leonard Arrington, about the Sesquicentennial History Project and things like that. So it's later than the 70s. The 70s is just kind of like when this movement's kind of really getting organized a little better. And it's a battle still today. But like you said, they love to be like, oh, fringe and the F word, fundamentalist, right? Like, oh my goodness, if you dismiss the magic worldview today, like you must be some kind of like weirdo. You're ready to start your own church. And you're like, really? Because we're the ones standing where the church has always stood. We're the ones staying with the foundation, and you guys are the ones who are trying to progress us to a different culture and a different church. And that's sometimes they don't like it when I use the word progressive, but I say, well, let's look at the tenets of your ideas. So, and I don't want to label anyone per se, because someone might adopt kind of more progressive ideas. Why do they do that? Is it the way they were trained? I mean, in the whole academic circle, there's a lot of pressure. You can't get published. You can't get peer reviewed if you don't conform your narrative to support the more secular and progressive and liberal atmosphere in America. So I completely understand why I think there actually might be more people who want to stand by Joseph Smith's character, but are in this battle of like, what do I do? And how do I do this? And frankly, I think members need to be more vocal and supportive of those who are brave to stand up and things like that, that there needs to be more support, because I know there are many authors and scholars who just feel like, yeah, I'll just be crucified. But anyways, that's a whole nother conversation. Yeah. So I don't want to just be fair. It's hard. It's that there are people who are intentionally trying to push forward an agenda for sure. And then there are people caught in the crossfire. Yeah.
And you can't blame, those people that their livelihoods are at stake, their career, whatever. I understand that. I understand. And so, yeah, that's why exactly like what we're doing right here on YouTube. And a lot of people like curse YouTube or like other platforms, and sometimes they do bad things. They can shut down speech, but sometimes like this, they allow this type of speech to happen.
Right.
And so that's why I'm always encouraging people, my viewers, if you have something to bring to the table, then do it.
Yeah.
Because the church can't do everything, not even the scholarship and people at BYU or whatever can do everything. Like, it's a big group effort, and there's a necessity for things like Joseph Smith Foundation, Christian Homestead, Last Dispensation, and so on and so forth. Like, you can't let them shut down truth that we know is true.
Yes. Yes.
And
I think that's really important. And just people need to feel empowered that the average person actually carries a lot more influence and power than they realize. It's the same in politics. It's the same with the church, and not meaning like changing the church, but within the church, like share your testimony. You don't realize the good that you can do. There's vocal people out there that want to change our doctrine and change our culture, but there's a lot of members that aren't comfortable with the idea that Joseph Smith was a bum on a log.
Yeah.
Well,
and it's funny because I don't know if you saw it or not, Hannah. I don't know if you saw it either, Troy, but recently I had the opportunity to interview the former president of the Council of the 12 Apostles of the Community of Christ. And we had a long discussion. And I did not have a very good feel for the Community of Christ. Like, I knew that they had like kind of strayed from their original ideals, but like when I spoke to her, I was kind of taken aback by how bad it was. And it's because of exactly what we're talking about. They don't have a true prophet, right? From our point of view, they don't have a true prophet.
Yep.
So like, the number one thing, it's good to have the scriptures, but we need to follow the prophet and the general authorities, and then do our research and, just do what we need to do. But if you're like them, you just get carried by the wind of, the politics of the day, the philosophies of the day, and these people that want to see the church go away. I'm sure that the Community of Christ probably had attacks from outside forces that didn't want them to because like, even though they had gone astray from our church, they probably still had a lot of good things, but like now they're basically like completely secular for the most part. Like, she didn't even really convince me that there was even a need for Jesus Christ or a prophet or the temples that they have, the Kirtland Temple and the Spiral Temple. So it's like, that's what we are in danger of if we don't act and fight back against those ever-present forces that just want to dilute our history and gospel and principles in the gospel and all that stuff.
Yes, you absolutely hit the nail on the head. In fact, we talk about that in chapter 13 of the Faith Crisis 2 book. We actually go into the Community of Christ and how it shifted from its foundation, right? We kind of, both of us start at the same place, and okay, they've ended up over here, and that's the same direction. This again, I mean, that's the definition of progressivism, right? Is saying, hey, we're gonna evolve, and yes, okay, yes, we do believe
there is good
in
progressive
continuing revelation.
right.
We do believe it's not like a Bible, we have a Bible, that's all we need. No, but this is the difference. The progressive viewpoint says the foundation is flawed, so we need to change the foundation to gain more light and knowledge. Traditionalism instead says, no, the foundation is solid. Joseph Smith said, there is no error in the revelations that I have taught. That's a strong statement for him to make. But I can bear testimony that is true. The foundation is solid. And what we do is we continue to build on that foundation because it won't move. It is a rock. And so that's the difference between our two viewpoints. Yes, I believe that continuing revelation is critical. It's important. God, there's so many things we don't know. We think we know so much today. We don't know anything. We don't have the sealed portion of the Book of Mormon, records of the lost tribes. There's so much we don't have. So there's so much more that we need to gain, but that doesn't mean we throw Joseph Smith out so we can gain more. It means we need to build on what we have to gain more. Hopefully that makes sense.
And along with that, I just want to add, along with like the difference between the two, like preserving the foundation and not, the other part is the progressive movement or the way that they think. It's like they think that we the people have to direct the church, like it's for us to direct the church or to take it in a new direction, and that's not true.
With the
It's
poll
the
of
Lord.
opinion, right? Instead
It's
of
the
following a prophet.
Yeah, it's
Which
the
is really
Lord's
coming from
church.
the
It comes,
outside the church, right? It's not really
Yeah.
the people, it's really picking up the attitudes from outside and then bringing it in.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm agreeing with what
Yeah.
you're saying.
and that's why you see these why you see protests at like church places, like church headquarters. That's not the way that this church works. The Lord speaks to the prophet, he speaks to the apostles, and it comes down, and that's how things change. And like, yeah, they do counsel with different people. They look at, they talk to all sorts of experts. I'm sure they're not dumb, and they see what the situation is in the world, in the church, and they consider things and come up with their own solutions. But ultimately, when something is enacted, some move in the church, they have at the very least pray about it, come to a consensus. They go through the power of councils. That's a video that Troy pointed out. There's a church video called the power of councils, where they talk, and then once it's all unanimous and they feel good about it, they prayed about it, that's when they actually move forward with something. But it's not because you have like a grassroots movement that needs to correct history and we need to like do these different things to go a certain direction. That's not how the church works.
Awesome. Let's get into the
I'm sorry,
Smith
Troy.
farm.
We're
No,
getting-
don't be sorry. This is all good stuff. You guys are like, everything you're saying is just like, yep, that's exactly right.
But yes, to the Enders research. Yes.
Well, and I just want to say too that I like some of the things, I like a lot of the things that Richard Bushman says in his book, but a lot of things I'm like, no, that's not it, like his sources,
Yeah.
and because I'm not saying he's not a good person and he's not sincere. Wasn't he even a patriarch at one time? I think
Yeah.
he was a patriarch, and even a bishop and a stake president, I believe. And it's with a lot of the, even I heard good things about Leonard Arrington, but we're not destroying their character.
Yeah,
Right?
the issue is we need to get to truth, right? And we need
Right.
to figure out what, because it impacts every single one of us in bearing off the kingdom and trying to build Zion, which is why
Right.
we're all here.
So page 226, lazy or industrious. I know you don't have the book in front of you, but you basically talk about these things in, I don't know why I'm doing this because you can't see it. That was redundant. But you talk about that in your video. Talk about the Smith farm.
Yes. Yes.
And all the stats you had and
Yes.
Can
And
you
like
do
I
that?
said, there is that podcast that's on. And so that will have all of the data, and it's right there on the screen with slides and things like that. So I want to direct people over to that to get really the full gist. But the essence is we have these stories, right? Specifically when it comes to the Mormonism Unveiled affidavits. And the question is, we can sit here like we have for the last bit and talked about like, okay, is this doctrinally viable? Are there, who do we trust on sources and things like that? But at the end of the day, is there any way to actually test them scientifically? And so that is what a man named Enders did. He said, what are quantifiable facts in these affidavits that we can go verify, we can go test? And so he went and got land records and tax records and farm account books and soil surveys and building surveys and just different specific data to say, okay, in Mormonism Unveiled, I can't necessarily test per se, did Joseph Smith, yes or no, kill a dog and sprinkle its blood to do like animal sacrifice? Like, I can't test that. None of us were there. But what I can do is they have this picture of the Smiths where like Joseph Capron's affidavit, the whole family of the Smiths were notorious for indolence, foolery, and falsehood. Their great object appeared to be to live without work, right? So the Smiths are lazy, they're not working. Henry Harris says, oh, he would tell fortunes. He had a stone he put in his hat to tell fortunes, and that's all that they did. Anyway, so we're saying, okay, so we have this picture of the Smiths, that they're lazy and they're indolent and they don't work. Can we test that? And so what he did, I think, was brilliant. But he went and he took the Smith family farm And he went back through, again, the tax records and the documentation that we have to see what its value was. And then he compared it to all of the other farms in the area, including the farms of the people who were attacking Joseph Smith. So just some specific data to throw a few out there, and I don't have all of it right here in front of me, but he compared the Smith farm with 175 farms in the area. 71 were valued higher per acre, 14 were valued equally per acre, and then 90 had a market value below that of the Smith farm. So 51.43% of the farms in the area were of lower quality and value than the Smiths. He goes through, okay, like, so basically he was documenting that the Smiths were not these squatters who were living in tents, disheveled and uneducated and kind of the scum of society, hanging around like, let me tell your fortunes, and digging out with the neighbors at night, right? Like that. He's like, no,
Is that your witch voice?
best I can do. No, just kidding. No, but that their farm was larger and it was better maintained than the majority of their neighbors. Whereas, interestingly enough, their critics primarily owned smaller farms that were of lower value. Now, we're not saying if someone has a lower farm and it's not as valuable or nice that they're a liar. We're not saying that. What we're saying is, that's kind of interesting, because here we have the Staffords and the Chases and the Caprins, and they're all like, those Smiths are like, they were lazy, and they kind of put themselves up on a pedestal, and it's like, oh, the Smiths were low. And you're like, really? Because, one second, Isaiah's gonna have to figure out this camera. This is my brother's setup. It's different than the setup I used last time. So you need help editing it, send me the file, I'll do it for you. To make up for penance.
I'm leaving that in.
I'm good. I'm good.
It's funny.
But no, so all of these neighbors that are saying, oh, the Smiths were these low members of society and everything, interestingly enough, they may have had a reason. And the reason why we can suggest that is William Smith himself said, this is just a really good quote. So I want to read it, because this is William Smith. This is Joseph Smith's brother. He lived through this, right? And he said, he was asked the question.
He was disaffected from the church.
Yeah.
He left.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So he has no motives he could just say a lot of junk if he wanted to about.
Right. Right. I mean, it is his family. So people are like, well, he still would have wanted to defend his family, but Joseph Smith wasn't necessarily the most popular guy in the nation too. So,
right.
Just, but the question was asked, it said that Joseph and the rest of his family were lazy and indolent. This is what William Smith says. He said, we never heard of such a thing until after Joseph told his vision, and not then by our friends. So he's like, we were pretty respectable until everybody decided they wanted to kick us out. He said, whenever the neighbors wanted a good day's work done, they knew where they could get a good hand, and they were not particular to take any of the other boys before Joseph either. We cleared 60 acres of the heaviest timber I ever saw. We had a good place. We had from 12 to 1,500 sugar trees. And we're going to talk about the statistics on the sugar trees and the maple, because it's absolutely incredible. It just statistically and with data annihilates this idea that the Smiths were lazy, that they were indolent. Anyway,
can I ask something really quick about the value of the farm? Are we talking about like the property value, or are we talking about its like production and how much they're paying in taxes, or what exactly are we looking at? Is the idea, if they're lazy, how are they able to afford this big of a farm and maintain it? Is that what the idea is?
Yes. Let me see if I have the one. So the assessment roll originally, when the Smiths bought the farm, it was undeveloped. It was only worth $700. 10 years later, the property had doubled in value, what the appraisal said, at $1,300. And I have the appraisal broken down. Like they had cleared 600 acres that were heavily forested. And we're talking about trees that are 4 to 6 feet in diameter.
Yeah.
And there's no power tools. This is Joseph Smith Sr. out with his boys clearing the land, right? That was approximately 600 trees that they cleared. They had to put up fencing, which placed about 4,000 10-foot rails, moving tons of stone. They put in an orchard, a barn. They built a shop. The frame home was unfinished at the time, but it was 2,000 to 3,000 rails. Again, it's not just drive to Home Depot and load it in my truck, right?
Well, I'll tell you, I have a homestead, and
Right.
I do not enjoy cutting branches or anything with my chainsaw. With my chainsaw, it kills me. And then I put up an electric fence using just T-posts, and that was one of the worst things I've ever done.
Yes.
So doing it like how he did it back then, putting up like an actual fence, cutting down entire trees with manual tools, that you cannot be lazy and accomplish that. It's impossible.
Yes.
It's impossible.
Right. I have a homestead myself, and I'm just grateful I live in the 21st century. I mean, some things you're like, oh, live in the 1800s, but I like the technology. So yes, I'm with you. So, well, and in addition to all of this, well, let me just finish William Smith's quote really quick, just so that we can just finish that. But he said, William Smith said that he felt personally that they worked really hard to clear their place and the neighbors were jealous. Which, if you read the Book of Mormon or you read scripture, this is a pattern, right? You got the Nephites, they're prospering, and then you've got the Lamanites that are the unconverted Lamanites, at least, and they're like, we could go in here, and there's competition going on, right? William says, we never knew we were bad folks until Joseph told his vision. We were considered respectable, but once people began to circulate falsehoods and stories in a wonderful way. And Joseph Smith himself said, it's actually a principle. He said that there are thousands of men that are honorable in the church, but he said that being honorable will call down envy.
That's what I was just thinking. Isn't this prophecy?
Mm-hmm.
His name would be known for good and evil.
Yes.
Right? Not just for good.
Right.
But equally and even more so for evil.
It's actually a principle. All good and honorable people have been persecuted in history. It's the nature of this life. So the Catholic Church has a term for this. The sign of contradiction is what they call it. It's a sign where, okay, anytime there's something good, there is going to be an adversarial attack against it. You see this with the life of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was perfect, and people hated him to the point that they killed him, right? Who was more loving? Who was more virtuous? Who was more courageous? Who was more compassionate and understanding than Jesus Christ was? No one. And yet people hated him. Why did they hate him so bad they had to kill him? Members of the church, in his day, that's who it was. It wasn't like, oh, these savages. No, civilized people, right? So,
right.
And this is one of the things that I think is important when we're looking at progressive and traditionalist history is you can't understand Joseph Smith unless you understand prophecy and unless you understand his life, right? So to some degree, none of us are going to fully understand Joseph Smith unless we've lived like him, which is not us. It's like Jesus Christ. We can only comprehend him so far as we can possibly do. I think that's what Joseph Smith said. He said, no man knows my history. He said, I can't tell it. I can't. And so it's like trying to explain to someone who's deaf and never has been able to hear the difference between Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and Handel's Messiah. It's impossible. Or to tell someone who's never tasted salt before, describe it to them, right? So
who even said that? Sorry, who even said that if you're not being persecuted, you're not being hated yet, you're not doing something right yet.
Right.
You're not completely living the gospel yet.
It's kind of in the New Testament.
I'm paraphrasing.
The Book of Mormon. And
I'm paraphrasing. I'm laughing because was that your son? That was hilarious. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah. He made a guest appearance. But yeah, it's all about like it really, because when you are living good, if you're being productive, if you're living morally, whatever the case may be, essentially what you're doing to the people around you, and it's not like you're trying to attack them, but they perceive it as an attack, is you're holding up a mirror because they see you doing well and them being the lazy ones. And then afterwards they project and say, oh, Joseph Smith is lazy, but in reality it was probably reverse. And it makes them feel bad about themselves. But the way that you handle that is, instead of like wallowing in self-pity, you look to the Smiths as an example and be like, you know what? I want to have a farm like the Smiths. I'm going to get to it and see what I can do. But that's that's one big difference between toxic people and people that aren't toxic, is how do you react to other people's success or other people's strengths. And so, yeah, Joseph Smith, I'm sure I know that he is very gifted in many different areas, and that's going to make people upset just by virtue of him being good at things. Other people are going to get upset at that.
Did you go through this whole list yet of things that they
not
did?
of their working. Is that where?
Yeah, and even what fascinated me, the biggest thing that fascinated me about what you said on your video even was, and I think you mentioned it, was about the neighbors. Most of their neighbors had smaller farms than they did.
Yes.
Yet they're calling them lazy, right? There's evidence that they even contracted out.
That's where I was going to go, because once you start going through the list, you're just like, okay, I
didn't have time
family
to do witchcraft.
Well, I mean, you can always make time for what you want to do, right? So
right.
I don't know, like I've heard some people like say like, yeah, you can't make the argument. I'm like, sure. The argument is saying, okay, if we can take the data from these affidavits that are quantifiable, because some things you can't test with data, but the things that we can test, if we test those and they turn out to be false, why would we trust the other information that can't be tested? And that is where Daniel Peterson has a really good, you mentioned Daniel Peterson, and I actually had a quote from him. This is what Daniel Peterson said. He said, if the Hurl that How affidavits cannot be trusted on matters that can be quantified and tested, there seems little reason to trust their judgments in the less tangible matter of character. So it's just trying to say, okay, before we just walk in here and we're like, oh my goodness, like there's eyewitnesses here, that are telling us. It's like, okay, hold on. There is such a thing as people lying. Welcome to the world. We all know them, I'm sure, in our lives, yep. Right? And so the key is, and this is one thing I want to address. Some people give me a really hard time when I talk about, okay, let's be careful when we look at sources, because they're like, well, you just don't like any source that's like, if someone doesn't believe in Joseph Smith, you just throw them out. And I'm like, really? Actually, no. There's a lot of sources from people that didn't believe Joseph Smith was a prophet that totally good with. I'm talking about, number one, let's actually look at what can be tested. Is it consistent? Do they even tell the same story over time? I mean, there's so many ways of testing someone. And again, it's a hard thing in our secular climate. It's hard for people to, this was one of actually the debates that were happening between the Quorum of the 12 and the progressive historians, this idea of saying like, is there a battle between light and darkness? And the more progressive viewpoint does struggle with that viewpoint. It's like, no, it's kind of like we're all neutral. And instead of realizing like, no, there is someone named Jesus Christ, and there's someone who hates Jesus Christ. His name is Lucifer. And they have been at war in an eternal conflict since before the foundations of this earth were laid. And every person is taking part in that conflict to some degree or another, whether you're on the fence or on one side or the other. And understanding that that's going on helps you make better judgment. So yes, there's a difference. If you have someone like Judas Iscariot who betrays Jesus Christ, when he's right there, he's a member of the Quorum of the 12. What does that do? Doctrinally, what happens when the light in you is turned to darkness? What does Jesus Christ say? He says, how great is that darkness? So again, if you're trying to understand Joseph Smith and interpret church history without an understanding of the gospel, without an understanding of how the spiritual realm works, without an understanding of revelation and prophecy and what that really is, you're not going to get Joseph Smith 100%. And that's fine. That's okay. You're going to be confused. You're going to be lost. You're going to be like, what's going on in his head? And maybe he's drawing it from this source or this source. But if you understand how prophecy really works, to the degree that you can, because I'm not going to say I anywhere close to being able to understand or completely relate to Joseph Smith. But even just the basics of the gospel that I know, you understand, wait a minute, there's a lot more going on here that you can't understand if you just take God out of the picture.
Well, isn't that why our prophet is telling us to receive, learn to feel and recognize the Spirit, learn to feel and recognize promptings,
Yes.
learn to feel and recognize personal revelation, understand. And if we understand it, then we empathize. Okay, a stronger word. Then we comprehend what the prophet was doing when he was writing the book of commandments, or writing those things which became the Doctrine and Covenants, writing Revelations, when he said there's no error in the revelations, and what he meant, because we receive light comprehends light.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And I just want to ask you something. You talked about sources. We're all, me, you, and Jared, I'll just say this to our audience. We said a little prayer before we started, and we are of one mind right now. I feel it. I feel the Spirit as we're talking about the prophet Joseph Smith. We are Holy Ghosters, brothers and sisters. There are 3 Holy Ghosters sitting right here. I love that. I call myself a Holy Ghoster now ever since I read your book. But there have been critics, and I even in the comments section, that have said, well, Hannah, she uses second, third-hand sources. Why are her sources, because they're pioneers and they're early members of the church, why are they more valid than the second and third-hand sources of the other people? Here's the difference. Those promote faith, and they come from different characters of people, right? The character of the person matters.
People
and if they
get
promote faith,
squirmy on promote faith, because they're going to be like, oh, well, are we just going to diss everyone that's not on this, a bandwagon to like protect the family name, right? That's the Fiona Gibbons argument against Joseph Fielding Smith. So I like what you said about do they have faith? Because this is something I'm just going to throw this out about. Some people are like, well, any source that's years down the line cannot be trusted as credible. Really? Because if you've had spiritual experiences, I can tell you that if you are faithful and true, you only progress in the Spirit and you progress in righteousness. And 10 years later, I don't know about you guys, but I would say spiritual experiences I had 10 years ago, I understand them better today than I did when I had them at the time, because my understanding of God and my just with repentance and growth and progressing, I come closer to God. And the more I do, the more light I gain and the better I understand the past. So sometimes people say like, well, so-and-so wrote about this spiritual experience and they wrote it 30 years after the fact. And I'm like, you know what? That person was faithful and true. They had the Spirit. I trust their account 30 years after the fact better than the one that was 2 years after the fact, because they're writing from an even more prophetic perspective. That is something, again, someone that doesn't accept the Holy Ghost, someone who doesn't accept revelation, someone who hasn't experienced spiritual experiences for themselves, they're not going to understand that. They're not going to grasp that. They're going to be like, what are you talking about? That makes no sense whatsoever. So again, and that's where I think the biggest thing is, as we talk about why do some people get taken out by these history claims or leaving the church, I think one of the biggest things is we need our youth to be better equipped in understanding the gospel, in knowing the scriptures. And that is what I love about Joseph Fielding Smith, because Joseph Fielding Smith is someone who had spiritual experiences. He's someone who sacrificed for living the gospel. I mean, if you read his biography, he left on a mission shortly after he was married. This was back in the days when they called people on missions when they were married, he gave up a very lucrative job so that he could work at the church office building. He left a different job and chose to get a lower paying job in another time of his life, because he said, I want to only be in a place where I'm going to be surrounded by a good atmosphere that's helping me keep my standards. He was a man who, when he was tempted, he said no. So he was someone that when he sat down and started studying Joseph Smith, he's like, I get this guy. I've had angels. I've had spiritual experiences. I've had dreams. I know what he's talking about, versus someone sitting down who says, like, I'm just going to say, someone like Richard Bushman, who says in his interview with John Dehlin, he's like, I'm not someone who has simple faith. He said, I had a faith crisis in college and I didn't recover it all of my testimony. He says that's his own words. So again, like, yes, I'm not going to impute his motives. I'm not going to throw him under the bus, but I'm going to say that if I have to, who would I trust more in terms of spiritual discernment to be able to grasp who Joseph Smith was? Joseph Fielding Smith is going to have a greater depth of understanding. And again, this whole conversation we're having here is something a secular scholar is going to be like, okay, these people have lost it. This is not academic in any way. This is not real history. But at the end of the day, do we care about being popular with the world, or do we care about getting to what real truth is? And I think that's
well,
what it really comes
I
down.
believe it's part of epistemology, though, in a sense. There are things that, and not just members of the church, it's called intuition. It's called spiritual knowledge. Some things we learn in the gospel of Jesus Christ. There are some things that are just discerned spiritually. And I think we've gotten away from that. Have we not?
Well, because sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No,
but
go ahead.
Because secularism, scholarship, science, they're focused mostly on objective truth, objective. And that's not the only truth in the world. They
and even that is not objective, right? I mean, there's a good quote we have in our book from a total secularist, and he's like, let's be honest, okay? No one is purely objective. But yes, go ahead, Jared. Sorry.
So it's like, yeah, they've basically, by definition of who they are, what they're trying to do, how they've defined science and whatever, they have eliminated an entire aspect of reality. And I understand why it does have to be that way, because you do have crazy people. That's the problem with this world. You have liars, you have crazy people that claim that they have spiritual experiences, but
yes.
So it's hard to tell who's telling the truth, but that doesn't mean that people aren't having true subjective experiences. So like, I don't know about you guys, but whenever I went on my mission, oh wait, the video went out.
Okay, guys,
What
if
happened?
we do this again, I promise you.
No, you're good.
It's just fine. I don't mind at all.
Good. It doesn't take that long for you to get back.
Yes. I like all the points you're making, Jared. So keep that thought, because these are really good points.
Thank you. This is a really good conversation.
I think this is the conversation people need, because people are confused about this and they're trying to wrestle, like, how do we weigh truth? And this is it's really important.
Yeah.
I was just going to leave up the colors and keep talking.
Right? Colorful.
Sorry if I'm a little low energy today. We've been sick. We actually have COVID right now. So
yay.
Yeah.
Not yay, I'm playing.
But it's actually getting better. Okay, so anyway, what I was saying is, I don't know about you guys, but when I was on my mission, I never wanted somebody to join the church because I was able to prove that the Book of Mormon was true, or prove anything except for through the Spirit, because that's really how things need to start when it comes to you and your knowledge about the truth as far as the gospel goes, is recognizing the Spirit, because the Spirit is able to do things with you that nobody else can do, both putting things in your mind, in your heart, and like just testifying to you that things are true. But additionally, as you continue down the path of life and on the covenant path, and you exercise prayer and stuff like that, you see blessings, and you see things that can't possibly happen unless this is real. That should be the most real thing. And so when you come across something about Joseph Smith, and it's like, Joseph Smith was a money digger and he was into mysticism, it's like, okay, all right, that maybe that unsettles me. But what you do is you hold on to your testimony, research it if you need to, pray about it. That's like probably the first thing, pray about it. And thankfully we have good resources like you, Hannah, Joseph Smith Foundation, and others, Interpreter Foundation, that if you really need to like satisfy that itch in your mind, you can go down and do it and find good sources. But ultimately, really, if you know that the Book of Mormon is true, if you've already prayed about it, if you've had miracles in your life, then it's obviously all true. It's all or nothing. It's not part. And if there's some kind of discrepancy, You just have to exercise patience, maybe work toward that answer, see if you can research it. But if you don't find an answer, I mean, just leave that to the eternities, but stick with what you know.
Mhm.
You know that you've been blessed. You know that you felt a certain way when you got baptized or when you were in church one day. So that's the problem with scholarship. And it's a problem, but it's not. They do have to do things the way that they do, but they don't necessarily take into account the spiritual side. And we as individuals have to take all of it together.
Yeah, can I make one comment on that? Because so I completely agree with what you're saying, and just to expand on that, in the Doctrine and Covenants, we're told that we're supposed to acquire wisdom through study and also by faith, right? So the two go hand in hand. And so what is study? Study is kind of what we're talking about here, studying out the sources. Who was Joseph Smith? Let's get to know him. But then also faith. And what is faith? Well, according to the lectures on faith, which I absolutely love, faith is believing that God exists, having a correct idea of his character and attributes, which I think is fundamental, not just like, oh, this is who God is. Do you have a correct idea of who God is? And knowing that your life is in harmony with his will, which brings in everything you were just saying, Jared. You got to live right. You got to be keeping the commandments. You've got to be in tune with the Spirit. You've got to be praying, and you got to say, okay, I know who God is. And that's one of the reasons why I do believe we're not just talking about history here, because this is critical to faith, because faith is having a correct understanding of God's attributes. It's how God lives and how he acts and how he deals with us as people. We're trying to become like him, right? Well, who is he? What kind of a communicator is he? What kind of a scientist, a father, a brother, an artist, a musician? I mean, obviously we have very crude culture and art, so his is much more advanced, but still he's a human being. And so that's one of the reasons where people are like, oh, it doesn't matter if a prophet is righteous, or it doesn't matter, maybe God did something different. It's like, no, God has character that you can rely on. If God doesn't have character that you can rely on and trust and know this is how he's going to behave, these are the laws he operates under, you can't have faith in him. He's a being that's constantly changing his mind. No. And so when he says, do not, in the Book of Mormon, he says, trust no man to be your teacher, except he is a man of God, walking in his ways, keeping his commandments. Mormon says, a bitter fountain cannot bring forth pure water. These are laws from God. He says, if you get pure water, it's coming from a pure source. In other words, if that Book of Mormon is pure, according to God's laws, that are the laws that govern the universe, the source had to have been pure as well. And the purity of Joseph Smith is to the level of the purity of the Book of Mormon. I mean, this Joseph Fielding Smith talks about this as well. And so, and the reason why it matters is because how are you going to live? All of us live our lives every day. Our worldview influences the decisions that we make and how we act. And trust me, your theology makes a difference. How I govern my life, the choices that I've made, sometimes making really stupid choices, versus good choices that have brought me success. When I understood God's character and I put myself in alignment with how he operates, that's when I had success. And if we think Joseph Smith was off just doing his own thing and playing his own game, but you know what? God was still fine with him. He was just, he didn't live good, but he still did incredible work. Well, guess what? Then I don't have to live worthy either. I'll be just fine letting it slide. Anyway, so sorry, that's a little bit long, but it does matter. We're not just sitting here talking about trivia. Truth matters. And so to the person that is squirming and says, I don't feel comfortable when the theology doesn't line up with the history, I say, well, there's a reason for that. Let's figure out truth in all areas.
I don't think the promises in Moroni would be there if they weren't called a promise. I don't think you talk about, right? When I was saying earlier, we've gotten away from that in our theology. We're afraid to say, I know the gospel is true because I feel the Spirit testify to me of that. I'm not saying people aren't doing that at testimony meetings, but there are people sitting in the audience going, well, I haven't felt that. So you can't, how dare you get up and say, the church is true, right? Or Alma chapter 32. You said study, we learn by study and by faith, right? Well, if you don't pick up and read Alma 32, which is study,
Right.
then you're not going to know the pattern of
Right.
receiving the Spirit, right?
Mhm.
But it's a promise. Those are promises in the Book of Mormon. Those
Yeah.
are promises by prophets. Our prophet wouldn't be telling us today. Talk about narratives. The leader of our church, our prophet, seer, and revelator, is telling us, seek personal revelation. He talks about the Spirit all the time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you're 100% right that is heavily looked down on or downplayed
Yeah.
increasingly. And we're warned about it in the Book of Mormon. I don't have the verse right in front of me, but right where he says, woe, if like to the Gentiles in the last days, like, woe to you if you live in a day where miracles cease, right? He says they will be there if faith exists. And there is, I do agree. I think people feel maybe intimidated or unsure, or maybe it's weird to be able to get up and say, I know by the Spirit, this is who Joseph Smith was, and that's why I think that was what was so different about Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ showed up and he said he spoke with authority. That means he walked in that room and he was like, this is how it is. This is truth. This is error. This is okay. This is not. Here's how history happened. He just said it instead of like, well, maybe I could be wrong, but this is my opinion, or like, yeah, there's truth everywhere and everybody's good and everyone just has a different perspective. And this is my perspective, but your perspective is just as like, no, he walked in and he was like, this is truth. And that took the Pharisees back. They were like, who does this guy think he is that could just walk in here? That's one of the reasons why people have a hard time with people like Ezra Taft Benson or Joseph Fielding Smith, these holy ghosters, right? Because they walk in and they say, this is truth. And I know it. And I don't know it because I had a feeling or because I had a thought. Yes, the Spirit speaks to us through our mind and our heart. But revelation is communication with God or God's messengers. It's a literal thing. It's not just like, oh, goosebumps. And I think that's something, again, that has to be
Right.
Jeremy Reynolds kind of gets confused about that in the CES letter, where he's like, well, a lot of people have goosebumps and a lot of people think they have a testimony. And you're like, no, you're misunderstanding what revelation is. Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation, but
yeah,
There's so much to it.
Yeah, there is. So what more about the Smith farm did you want to? Okay.
Yeah. Let's see. Well, probably what I would say is people can go watch the video, but like you said, there's a list where we go into the Smiths were
And we'll leave the
contracting.
link to the video.
Yeah.
too.
The Smiths
Okay.
were contracting at work. They were digging and rocking wells, digging for salt, harvesting crops, like for other people. So they were running their own farm. Plus they were doing all this work. Plus they were producing all these items for resale. Carpentry work, cider, garden produce, maple syrup, maple sugar. Lucy Mack Smith records that in 1 year, they made 1,000 pounds per year. Daniel Peterson estimated that level of production that the Smiths were producing, they would have had to tap more than 500 trees, collect 60,000 pounds of sap, and burn 10,000 pounds of wood over a week of 20 to 24-hour days to burn off that water. Now, again, how are they getting the wood? They're not just pulling it in from Home Depot, right? They got to go cut down the trees. They've got to. So this is tons of labor. Plus, this is what I just love about the Smith family. And this is one of the reasons why we've got to bring back more of this history. It's so inspirational. But the Smith family actually held family scripture study or devotionals twice every day. And Lazar Snow said that Joseph Smith did a period where it was 3 times a day. Okay, I'm going to be completely honest. I'm nowhere near that level. I'm just trying to do, I'm not even going to admit publicly on YouTube how often like we hit our family scripture study mark every week. But I'm not anywhere close to the Smiths. Sorry, I have goals. It's hashtag goals on my list, but and I have a dishwasher. I have a washing machine and a dryer, and I have a phone, and I live at a heated house where I just hit the thermostat and sets it exactly the temperature I want, right? Here's the Smith family living in the 1800s with none of this technology. They have to support themselves, and they have a big family, right? When are those babies being born? How is it fun? It's not really fun being pregnant and going through all of that on the frontier. Like, let's be honest about what this is like, right? And still, they made that scripture study that kind of a priority. That's who this family was. This picture we have in our minds of, well, maybe they were, and maybe Lucy Mack Smith was kind of just arrogant and prideful. It's like, go learn about this family. You'll be blown away. There's no other family today quite like them.
Can I read a passage real quick?
Absolutely.
Are you ready to wrap it, or what's going on with you guys?
Just whatever.
What about you, Hannah?
I'm good with whatever.
Okay. This is Lucy Mack Smith. She says, by the time Lucy, oh no, I'm sorry. This is Lucy Mack Smith's statement. Where did okay, I lost it. Hold on. Who am I quoting? William Hamblin has likewise concluded that Lucy Mack Smith's statement was clearly a denial, not an admission.
Oh, you're probably, I know what you're reading, and that is actually on our website, LDS Answers, that quote that Richard Bushman says is Lucy Mack Smith admitting to their involvement in magic. And if you actually look at the original quote in context, she's actually saying the opposite. That's on our website for free too.
Right. She basically says that they were not, where is it right here? Lucy explicitly denies that they were involved in such things, magic. She also denies that the Smiths were lazy. So I'm going to take her word for it. The mother, the matriarch of the family, right? That knew her children,
support her.
Right. And she even said that, oh, well, Joseph got that title, or they called him a gold digger because he was working for a silver miner.
Yes.
Right?
And okay, let's remember that story. Joseph Smith clarified it himself. He's like, I was hired as a common laborer, and I was assigned to go and work on the silver mine until he could finally convince the guy, this is stupid, let's get to a different job. Finally convinced the guy, and he's like, that is where all those stories about a treasure digger came from. Anyway, so it's just kind of funny how then we've got this whole whoa, and I mean, it's in the Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism, like Joseph Smith Sr. and Joseph Smith are fighting because Joseph Smith is like, let's not hang out with those money digging people anymore, and Joseph Sr. is like, yes, we will. And you're like, okay, Joseph Smith Sr., like, have you read what the Lord said about Joseph Smith Sr.? He sits in the council with the patriarchs and is a God. That's in the Doctrine and Covenants. Have you read about him? There's an amazing book. It's called The Father of the Prophets by Mark L. McConkie. Absolutely incredible. I want to do a movie or something about Joseph Smith Sr. one day. He is like the unsung hero of the Restoration.
Where did the
movement.
rumor come from that he was an alcoholic?
There is a blessing where it's crossed out, and that's a whole nother conversation. I don't want to get into, we could get into it. We can come back for that. But yes, okay.
That'll pique some interest for next time.
I would love to come back and talk about Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith.
So I want to ask both of you guys something. I'm going to take a little turn here. You know how the Book of Mormon talks about the church being in condemnation, right? Well, maybe not those exact
Doctrine and Covenants. Yeah.
Okay. But even the Book of Mormon says that the church became prideful, or the church, it talks about the church. See, I should have had better references.
No, you're
good.
I think the verse you're probably thinking of, and I don't have it right off the top of where it's at, but it's interesting. Mormon says pride came into the church, at least among the Nephites, not among the church, but those who professed
to
be members of the church.
That's the point I make.
Yeah.
Are we seeing that happen today? Do you think? I
think so. I think it depends. I think that oh gosh, that's a lot to like think about, because like what I see right now is at the very least things are becoming more obvious as far as like people separating themselves, wheat and tares, people like choosing to leave the church, people that are continuing in the church. But as far as like pride goes, I think so. I think that comes with a lot of things, but it's something that is kind of promoted, I feel like, by society, is to be proud of yourself, be yourself, and accumulate wealth and just be awesome. That's one thing, but I do think that there are a lot of tares. I think that, and I know that this isn't like the most popular thing to say, but I think in certain areas there are more tares than not. You know, I've been in a couple wards where it was kind of uncomfortable. Like everyone felt kind of like robots, and a lot of people were kind of distracted by just worldly things, sports, or you know, going out and camping, ATVs, going on a vacation, whatever. And it's just like it was just like nonstop, just like pleasure seeking and pride. And one thing that has always like struck me in the Book of Mormon is clothes. How like one of like the first symptoms, it seems to be like when you have a society that starts to get prideful and like sick spiritually, is they start to like wear costly apparel. And the reason why you do that is to separate yourself and show that you're higher up. And I feel like that's something that I've seen kind of like increase in certain areas. And this is no disrespect to anybody in Utah. I am originally from Utah, but I feel like Utah has kind of like become more and more and more worldly and secular, more and no disrespect to anyone in California, but kind of like falling in the footsteps of California and just becoming more.
I'll say this because I'm in Utah, right?
Yeah, I know you're in
It's a
Utah.
battleground, and it's a battleground for a reason. It's ground zero for the center of the church. So the Lord's got his best spirits and the devil's got his best spirits. Like they're both sending their best. But I mean, there's amazing people everywhere. But that's why I just mean like it's a battleground. There's some of the best people, and there are some very interesting characters. Yes.
Yes. So I don't know. I feel as far as like pride in the church, I kind of think so. Among the tares, they're becoming more tarry, more, you know, I've seen so many of them from like my mission, or just people that I grew up with, that it seemed like they were good LDS, but I always knew that they had kind of had a bent toward, you know, the world and fashion and being cool, and you know, being cool by the worldly sense. And they got to a point where they couldn't stay in the church. They separated themselves. And anyway, sorry, I feel like I'm just rambling, but I would say yes.
I know.
I would say yes.
Yeah. Well, oh, go ahead, Hannah.
I was just going to comment on that. I think a good passage is Mormon 8, because I wouldn't consider myself a good judge of the state of the world, but I think Mormon is, or Moroni, I guess this is Moroni. But Mormon, in Mormon 8, verse 35, this is when he says, I speak unto you as if you were present, and yet you're not. But he says, but behold, Jesus Christ hath shown you unto me, I know you're doing. And he goes on, he says, I'm seeing your day. He says, guys, you're walking in the pride of your hearts. You love money. You love your fine apparel, the adorning of your churches more than you love the poor and the needy. And he says, this is the very, okay, this is the Book of Mormon. This is not me, right? So don't crucify me, guys. He says, O ye pollutions, ye hypocrites, ye teachers who sell yourselves for that which will canker. Why have ye polluted the holy church of God? What is the holy church of God? Is that the Baptists? Is that the Methodists? Is that the Seventh-day Adventists? No. That's us. That we are the holy church of God. He says, why are ye ashamed to take upon you the name of Christ? Why do ye not think that greater is the value of an endless happiness than that misery which never dies? Why do you adorn yourselves and yet suffer the hungry and the needy and the naked and the sick and the afflicted to pass by you? Why do you build up secret combinations to get gain? And he says, the sword of vengeance hangs over you. I call unto you to repent. Miracles are possible. And then he finishes, right, the rest of the book of Mormon. So he's pretty strong on our day, but I don't want to leave it on that note, because like you said, the wicked are becoming more wicked and the righteous are becoming more righteous. We know from scripture that this earth is the most wicked earth of every earth that Jesus Christ created. That's pretty crazy. World without number, and we're on the worst. It's like, congratulations, guys, you signed up.
Isn't that what Joseph Smith taught?
It's in the Pearl of Great Price.
Yeah.
And then there's an
Enoch,
interesting,
when he's
yeah. There's a interesting quote from Brigham Young where he says that God, like this is the earth that would crucify Jesus Christ, right? So you have spirits like Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith and Enoch and Moses and Adam and incredibly great spirits sent to this earth. And then you've got the worst spirits sent here. And what happens when you have that kind of a conflict? It sharpens, right? And the righteous become more righteous and the wicked become more wicked. And Brigham Young taught that was so that this earth could condescend down to the lowest so that it can be raised to the highest. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. Anyways.
It's funny you say that because, yeah, there's a wedge, right? The righteous are becoming more righteous. The wicked are becoming more wicked. Some of the most righteous spirits are being sent to this earth right now. Some of the most wicked spirits.
Yes.
So there's a wedge created. It's funny because if you go back 80 years ago, or even sooner, Bruce R. McConkie was writing things about it was a battle with the Mormons and other Christians. Now we're like, we love you, Christians. We're all friends.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, there's wickedness out there. We need to huddle together, right?
Yes.
And build on some common ground.
Yeah. And yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, but even the history, 70 years or 160 years, sorry, to this. I always say 160 years since the restoration till the 70s.
Yeah.
It's been 203 years since 1830, sorry.
Yeah.
But, right? Did I say that right? Or from 1820?
Keep going. I'm not doing the mental math in my head.
But anyway, my point is that wouldn't we believe that other history that was around for 160 years, that those people were closer to the people that lived during that time?
Well, let me give you this.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I do. When would you guess the highest? Look at the fruits, right? That's what Jesus Christ says. You'll know them by their fruits. So what are the fruits of us changing our history versus the fruits of the dominant narrative? Well, the highest growth of the church when we were at our peak, 1988. What was going on in 1988? Pushing the Book of Mormon, pushing, this is where, some of President Benson's greatest talks come from. The videos at the time, the seminary, the focus was get to the scriptures. Joseph Smith was a great man. We're going to be proud of the restoration. I was just rewatching Ensign to the Nations. I don't know if you guys have seen that. It's an older church film. It's absolutely incredible. But President Hinckley has a testimony at the beginning of it that was so amazing. I was like, I'm going to clip this out and share it on social media because I was just, I listened to it twice. I was so moved to tears. But it was that sense of we are proud of where we came from because we don't need to be ashamed. And that's what I want people to take away. If there's one thing that I can accomplish before I die is I want people to know you don't have to apologize for Joseph Smith. You don't have to apologize for our foundations, where we came from. You can be proud of it. Yes, there are people who apostatize. There's people who made mistakes. But when you look at what God did and what was done and the foundation that was laid, it is something you can be proud of. And that foundation is worth defending because it is the only hope for the world. We have a world that is falling apart right now, and people are trying every kind of expert, every kind of psychology, every kind of program, every kind of fundraiser, like money, billionaire corporations, like everything we can do to solve all of these problems, everything from pornography to health epidemics to political problems and war and teenage rebellion and divorce and mental illness and just the problems go on and on and on and on. We're trying everything except for mostly the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I just want to bear my testimony that the gospel of Jesus Christ will work. We have to have faith. We have to, and that is what I believe is at stake. The adversary is trying to move us away from the gospel of Jesus Christ, move us away from our foundation, because he knows that that is where the true source of hope and the answers are. And that's why I believe right now we need people to stand up. Every single person. Joseph Smith's patriarchal blessing says that the day would come when thousands would stand up to defend his character. When he was in Liberty Jail and he's just crying before the Lord over all of these brethren that had turned against him, the 3 witnesses had turned against him. And Joseph Smith tells him, he says, fools will have you in derision, but he says, thy people will never be turned against you by the testimony of traitors. We are Joseph's people today. We are the pioneers of our generation. We are the Latter-day Saints. Be proud of that. Be proud of what you come from, and do not be turned against your roots by the testimony of traitors. There you go.
Praise to the man. who-
That's a good note to end on.
Yeah.
That's my
Yeah.
fire and brimstone. There's soapbox.
Are you guys saying we're ending? I think I'm feeling it too.
I think maybe we should, otherwise it's going to go too long.
I know, right? Okay.
Not that
so-
I couldn't like talk forever.
No,
but
I'm. This has been. Thank you so much, Hannah.
No,
I
thank you to
hope that
both of
we
you guys.
covered everything that we wanted
Loved it.
to. Before we go, I want to share everybody just real quick the website. Just one more time. Okay. Whoops, sorry. Where is it? Right here. Okay, folks, so here it is. Go check it out. There's all kinds of stuff. Yeah. And the Faith Crisis series.
And I
the
was just
book-
going to mention, Troy,
Go
that
ahead.
is
No,
our
go ahead.
store. Yeah. If you go to the main, just josephsmithfoundation.org, we have
there.
a ton
I
of
clicked on it.
resources that are free, hundreds and hundreds. So yes, we do have products that unfortunately we can't just ship for free because I'm not a billionaire. One day, maybe. No.
So if I just leave the link again, they can click to the store, right?
Yes, yeah. You just go to
Okay.
Joseph Smith Foundation. There's a link to the store at the top, but there's tons of other resources and you can search and things like that.
Okay.